Sarah had always believed that love could overcome any obstacle, that family was the most important thing in life. But as she sat at the dinner table, staring at the familiar faces around her, something had shifted. Ethan, her husband John's son from a previous marriage, was glaring at her with such disdain that it made Sarah's skin crawl. She had been trying for months to bridge the gap between them, to make him see her not as the outsider, but as someone who cared deeply for him. Yet, no matter what she did, Ethan continued to treat her like an enemy. That evening was no different. He had barely said a word throughout dinner, only offering sharp, cutting looks whenever their eyes met. Sarah felt the tension building in her chest. She had to confront him. "Ethan, can we talk?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. Ethan's eyes shot up, meeting hers for the first time that night. "What about?" he sneered. "You've been acting distant, rude, and I can't stand it anymore. I'm your father's wife, not your enemy. Why are you so angry with me?" Sarah's words hung in the air like a challenge, but instead of apologizing or backing down, Ethan scoffed. "Maybe I don't like the idea of you trying to replace my mom," he said, his voice cold. Sarah's heart dropped. She knew his mother had passed away when Ethan was just a child, but she didn't expect him to still be holding on to that bitterness. "I'm not trying to replace anyone, Ethan. I'm just trying to be part of this family," she replied, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Well, you're not doing a very good job of it," Ethan shot back, his tone venomous. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. She had been patient for so long, letting his comments slide, but tonight was different. She was done. "I've done everything I can to make you feel comfortable," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "I've treated you like my own son, and this is how you repay me?" Ethan's smirk widened, and he leaned back in his chair, looking like he was enjoying this confrontation. "Maybe if you weren't so desperate to be liked, I'd actually respect you," he retorted. That stung, more than Sarah would admit to herself. But she wasn't going to let him win. "You don't have to like me, Ethan, but you will respect me," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Ethan snorted, clearly not taking her seriously. "Respect? Why would I respect you?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Just as Sarah was about to respond, she heard footsteps from the hallway. John entered the room, looking confused but quickly taking in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Ethan and I were just having a conversation," Sarah said, trying to keep the tension from escalating further. "No, we weren't," Ethan interrupted. "She's just being a nagging stepmom, trying to act like she's the boss of me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had tried to be patient, to be understanding, but this was too much. She turned to John, her voice trembling with frustration. "John, you need to do something about this. Ethan's behavior is completely out of line." John's expression faltered for a moment, but then he turned to Sarah. "You're exaggerating. Ethan's just going through a phase. He'll grow out of it." Sarah's heart sank. He wasn't backing her up, not in the way she had hoped. "This isn't a phase, John. This is real, and I'm not going to stand by while he treats me like this," Sarah said, her voice growing more desperate. John sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm just trying to keep the peace." "You're overreacting, Sarah." Sarah's frustration boiled over. "Overreacting? You're not even listening to me. I've been patient for so long, but you're letting your son walk all over me, and it's not fair." Ethan chuckled, clearly enjoying the drama unfolding before him. "See? She's crazy. I don't know why you married her, Dad." That was the last straw. Sarah could feel the anger surging through her. She had reached her breaking point. With all the strength she could muster, she stood up from the table and turned to John. "I'm done. I don't know what happened to the man I married, but I can't keep living like this. If you can't see how badly your son is treating me, then maybe we shouldn't be together." John looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence, and Sarah felt her heart racing in her chest. She had said it. She had finally said it. But the words hung heavy in the air, and Sarah wasn't sure if there was any going back from them. Ethan's smirk faded, but he didn't speak. He was silent, watching this scene unfold like it was some kind of twisted entertainment. Sarah's hands trembled as she walked toward the door. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't live in a house where she wasn't respected. With a final glance at John, she left the room, her heart broken but resolute. She wasn't going to be anyone's punching bag any longer. Sarah's heart was racing as she walked away from the dinner table, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't quite grasp. She had always prided herself on being patient, on giving her family the space they needed to come together, but tonight had been different. It wasn't just the cruel words from Ethan. It was John's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. He hadn't stood up for her. He hadn't even tried to mediate the situation. Instead, he had dismissed her feelings as though they didn't matter. As Sarah made her way through the living room, the weight of the situation began to settle in. She couldn't believe how bad things had gotten. She had tried everything. She had tried to be understanding, to connect with Ethan, to give him the space he needed to accept her into their family. But every effort had been met with contempt. The longer she thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't just hurt by Ethan's words. She was devastated by John's indifference. It was as though, in his eyes, she wasn't important enough to defend. Sarah's mind wandered back to their earlier years together, to the time when things were so different. John had been her rock, the man she had married because she believed in his strength and his kindness. They had been a team, facing the world together. But now, it felt as though she was fighting a battle alone. She had stood by him through everything, through his job stress, his personal struggles, and the challenges that came with blending their families. Yet, when it came to the one thing that mattered most, her dignity, he had turned his back on her. She knew she had to talk to him. She had to make him understand how deeply she was hurt. But the thought of confronting him made her stomach churn. What if he didn't care? What if he saw this as just another of her overreactions? Sarah paced back and forth in the hallway, trying to calm her thoughts. She had never felt so alone in a relationship that was supposed to be her safe place. She had always believed in communication, in being open about their feelings, but now it felt like everything had shifted. Sarah took a deep breath and finally walked into the study where John was sitting. He was staring at his phone, oblivious to her presence. She stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering her courage, before stepping into the room. "John, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. John looked up, his face blank. "About what?" he asked, as though he hadn't just witnessed the emotional explosion at dinner. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself before continuing. "About tonight. About how you let Ethan treat me. About how you didn't back me up when I needed you the most." John set his phone down on the desk and leaned back in his chair, clearly annoyed. "Sarah, I've told you before. Ethan's just going through a phase. He's a teenager. He's not going to like you overnight." Sarah shook her head, frustration bubbling up again. "It's not just about liking me, John. It's about respect. I've given him everything, patience, understanding, kindness, and he's still treating me like I don't belong here. And you," her voice cracked as the words got stuck in her throat, "and you didn't defend me. You didn't even try to stop it." John's face hardened. "I don't know what you expect from me. You want me to choose sides? Ethan is my son. Of course, I'm going to protect him. I'm not going to just turn on him because you're upset." The words stung, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. It felt like a punch to the gut. How could he be so blind to her pain? "I don't want you to turn on him," Sarah said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I need you to stand by me. I need you to be on my side for once. I can't keep doing this alone." John's expression softened, but only slightly. "I'm just trying to keep the peace, Sarah. I don't want to make things worse." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You call this peace? Letting me get humiliated at the dinner table, letting your son walk all over me. That's peace." John was silent for a long time, his gaze shifting away from her. Sarah felt the tears threatening to fall, but she fought them back. She refused to cry in front of him. "Not anymore. I'm tired, John," she said quietly. "I'm tired of feeling invisible in my own home. I'm tired of being the only one who cares about making this work. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, John spoke, his voice lower than before. "I didn't know you felt this way." Sarah shook her head. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy trying to keep the peace between you and Ethan. You didn't notice how far I've been pushed." John looked at her, a flicker of guilt passing through his eyes. But Sarah couldn't tell if it was genuine or just a fleeting moment of realization. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said finally, but the apology felt hollow. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do with that? Was he sorry for the way he treated her, or sorry that he had been caught? She had no answers, and that terrified her. I don't know if I can do this anymore, John, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. John's eyes widened, but before he could speak, Sarah turned and walked out of the room. She had made up her mind. She couldn't keep living in a relationship that was slowly suffocating her. She needed space, clarity, and time to figure out what was next. She didn't know if she would ever get the apology she needed or if she could ever forgive John for the way he had failed her. But for now, all she knew was that she had to walk away. The days after Sarah left the study felt like a blur. She had tried to go on with her routine, but it was impossible. Every time she walked into the house, the tension felt thicker, heavier. She could feel John's presence, but it felt distant, like he was a stranger. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. It wasn't just the silence, though that was deafening. It was the weight of everything that had happened and everything still left unsaid. Sarah had tried calling John a few times, but he never picked up. She sent him a few messages, but they went unanswered. It was as though he had completely withdrawn, retreating into a space where Sarah couldn't reach him. The worst part was the realization that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to reach her either. She had done everything she could to try to make the relationship work, but now it seemed like she was fighting a losing battle. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep waiting for someone who wasn't going to step up. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to have no such reservations. His attitude didn't change one bit. If anything, it only grew worse. He continued to act as if Sarah were invisible, refusing to acknowledge her presence, and whenever they crossed paths, his snide comments became more frequent and more cutting. Sarah had tried talking to him once, asking him what had happened, why he was so angry, but he just shrugged and walked away. She could tell that there was more to his anger than he was letting on, but every time she tried to get through to him, he shut her out. That only left Sarah with one option: confront John. It was late one evening, after another exhausting day, that Sarah decided she couldn't wait any longer. She was done with the silence, the tension, and the lack of communication. If John wouldn't come to her, then she would go to him. She walked into the living room, where John was sitting in his usual spot, watching TV. His gaze shifted to her as she entered, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, as though he didn't know how to begin. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. John glanced at her for a moment before turning off the TV, setting the remote down on the coffee table. "About what?" he asked, his tone guarded. Sarah sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "About everything, John. About how I feel. About how you've been acting. About how we've been living in the same house, but barely communicating." John's face softened a little, but Sarah could see the strain in his eyes. "I know things have been tense, Sarah, but I don't know what you want me to say. I've already apologized. I'm trying. I'm really trying." Sarah shook her head. "Apologies don't fix this, John. You've been trying, but it's not enough. You've been distant, and it's not just me. You're distant from Ethan too." John's expression faltered for a moment, his eyes flicking away. "Ethan's going through a lot. He's not an easy kid to deal with. But he's my son, and I have to take care of him." "And what about me?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been here, John. I've been here every day, trying to make this work. But I can't keep doing this if you're not going to be here with me." There was a long silence between them. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I don't know what to do anymore," John admitted finally, his voice low. "I'm torn between you and Ethan. I don't know how to fix this." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing John admit that he was torn between her and his son only made the pain worse. It was as if she had become an afterthought in his life. "I'm not asking you to choose, John. I'm asking you to be here with me. I'm asking you to stand by me, like you did when we first got married." John sighed and rubbed his temples. "I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle everything, Sarah. I'm trying, but I feel like I'm failing." Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She had heard these words before. She had heard the same excuses, the same promises that things would get better, but they never did. It always felt like she was the one holding everything together while John kept drifting further away. "I can't do this on my own, John," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I need you. I need you to be the man I married. I need you to fight for us." John was silent for a long time. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, but she also saw something else, resignation. It was as though he had already given up. "I don't know if I can be that man anymore," he said finally. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She had hoped, deep down, that he would find the strength to step up, to fight for their marriage. But hearing him say that he couldn't even try was the final blow. "Maybe that's the problem, John," Sarah said, standing up from the couch. "Maybe we're both too broken to fix this." John didn't say anything, and Sarah knew, in that moment, that their marriage was beyond repair. She had tried. She had given everything she had, but she couldn't keep carrying the weight of a relationship that had already crumbled. Sarah turned and walked away, out of the living room, and up the stairs to the bedroom. As she closed the door behind her, she finally allowed herself to let go. She didn't know what her future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living a life that wasn't her own. The next few days felt like they were dragging on for Sarah. She had closed herself off, locking herself in the bedroom with the door shut, not wanting to face anyone, not even John. He hadn't tried to reach her again after their last conversation. The silence between them had become unbearable, like an unspoken truth neither of them could face. Ethan, too, remained distant, his hostile attitude unchanged. The house had become a place she no longer recognized. It wasn't the home she had once dreamed of, filled with warmth and laughter. Now, it felt like a cold, empty shell. Sarah's thoughts were a constant storm of confusion and frustration. She wanted to understand what had gone wrong. She had tried to make everything work, to be the best wife and stepmother she could be, but it seemed like her efforts were in vain. She had no idea what had happened to the man she had fallen in love with. Where was the John who had promised to always stand by her? The John who had made her feel like they could conquer anything together? The man she had married seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by someone who couldn't even see her pain. She sat by the window in their bedroom, looking out at the rain pouring down, the sound of the drops hitting the window matching the turmoil inside her heart. She had reached a point where she knew she couldn't continue living like this. She couldn't keep hoping for something that wasn't going to happen. She had tried to talk to John, to explain how she felt, but it had gotten to the point where words no longer held any meaning. She felt as if they were speaking different languages, unable to truly understand each other anymore. The silence was louder than any words could ever be. Sarah's mind wandered back to the first time she met John. They had met through mutual friends at a dinner party, and from the moment she laid eyes on him, she knew he was someone special. He was kind, thoughtful, and had a way of making everyone around him feel at ease. They hit it off right away, spending hours talking and laughing. She had never met anyone like him before. It was easy to fall in love with him. Their relationship had moved quickly, and before she knew it, they were married. It had felt like the beginning of something wonderful. But now, Sarah couldn't help but feel that it was all slipping away. She had given everything to this marriage, to this family. She had put her own needs aside to make things work, but in the end, it had all come crashing down. It wasn't just the issues with Ethan, it was the complete lack of connection with John. He had become someone she didn't even recognize. After the conversation in the living room, Sarah had expected things to get better. She had hoped that John would realize how much she was hurting and step up, but nothing had changed. If anything, it seemed like he had retreated even further. The longer Sarah sat there in silence, the more she realized that she couldn't wait for him to change. She couldn't keep living in a relationship where she felt invisible, where her feelings didn't matter. The thought of leaving the house crossed her mind several times, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. It wasn't that she didn't love John anymore. It was that she didn't know who he was anymore. He wasn't the person she had married. The love she had once felt for him had been replaced by a deep sadness and disappointment. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a cage. Sarah knew she needed to make a decision. She couldn't stay in limbo, stuck in this painful cycle. As much as she didn't want to face the reality of it, she knew that leaving might be the only way to find peace. The thought of starting over was daunting. She had built her life around John, around their marriage, and the idea of walking away from it all felt like a betrayal. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't continue living in a relationship where she felt alone. She deserved more than that. She deserved someone who would fight for her, someone who would see her as more than just an afterthought. Sarah spent the next few days thinking everything through, weighing her options. She knew that leaving wouldn't be easy, But she also knew that staying in a toxic environment would only break her further. She had to put herself first for once. For too long, she had put everyone else's needs before her own. She had tried to be the perfect wife and stepmother, but now it was time to take care of herself. The hardest part was knowing that it wasn't just her own happiness that was at stake. Ethan would be hurt, and John would probably never understand why she had to leave. But Sarah had realized that she couldn't control their feelings. She could only control her own. After several sleepless nights, Sarah finally made up her mind. She couldn't stay in this house anymore. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. The next morning, Sarah packed her things. She didn't know where she would go or what her next steps would be, but she knew that she couldn't keep living a lie. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear of the unknown, but relief that she was finally taking control of her life. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew that this was the right decision. She had spent too long living in the shadows, too long waiting for things to get better. It was time for Sarah to finally live for herself. The days that followed Sarah's decision were filled with a mix of uncertainty and relief. As she stepped out of the house that had once been her home, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just the physical act of leaving. It was the emotional release that came with it. The constant tension, the feeling of being trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark, all of it had been holding her down for too long. Sarah didn't know exactly where she was going to go, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay. She had spent so many years trying to make it work, trying to be the perfect wife and stepmother, but now she had to put herself first. It wasn't easy to leave, and as she drove away from the house, she felt a pang of guilt. Ethan and John were still there, and despite everything that had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed them. But deep down, Sarah knew she couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness. She had to find her own path. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah stayed with a close friend, Emily, who had been there for her through thick and thin. Emily's home was a safe space, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. She spent her days in a daze, not really sure what to do with herself. Her life had revolved around John and Ethan for so long, and now she was faced with a blank slate. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. She found herself questioning everything: the choices she had made, the sacrifices she had endured, and most importantly, the person she had become. Had she lost herself in the process of trying to hold everything together? Sarah knew she had to figure out what came next, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself the luxury of not having all the answers. She gave herself permission to just be for a while. During this time, Sarah began to reconnect with herself. She picked up old hobbies she had neglected for years, like painting and reading. She spent hours walking in the park, allowing her mind to clear. It was a strange feeling to have time to think and reflect without the constant pressure of family responsibilities weighing on her. But as much as she relished the newfound freedom, there was still a part of her that felt empty. The guilt lingered, even as she made the decision to move forward. One evening, Emily suggested they go out for a drink. Sarah hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face the world again. But Emily insisted, saying it would be good for her to get out of the house and meet new people. Sarah agreed, if only to get out of her own head for a while. They went to a small bar downtown, a cozy place with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background. The atmosphere was relaxed, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah found herself smiling again. She didn't have to be anyone's wife or stepmother. She could just be Sarah, a woman enjoying a night out with a friend. As the night wore on, Sarah's laughter came easier. Emily had a way of making her feel at ease, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. For the first time since leaving John, Sarah felt like she was reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost. It wasn't just about the fun of the night out. It was about the realization that she didn't have to define herself by her relationship with John or anyone else. She was more than just a wife or a stepmother. She was Sarah, an individual with her own dreams and desires. The night ended with a sense of clarity Sarah hadn't expected. She realized that while her marriage had ended, it wasn't the end of her life. It was a new beginning. The next morning, as Sarah sipped her coffee, she made a decision. She would start fresh. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She was going to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She began looking for a new place to live, searching for a space that was just hers. It wasn't about running away from her past, but about creating a new chapter for herself. She contacted a therapist, deciding that it was time to start working through everything she had been holding in for so long. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt hope. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she knew she was stronger than she had realized. The pain of the past still lingered, but it didn't define her anymore. She had made the hardest decision of her life, but now she was free to live it on her own terms. Sarah was no longer afraid to take control of her own happiness. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She wasn't alone. She had herself, and that was enough. As the days passed, Sarah started to piece together the life she had longed for. She found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a place she could call her own. The process of moving in felt like a fresh start, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly living for herself. Sarah knew that healing would take time, but she was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to face it head-on, knowing that she could create a life filled with peace, happiness, and love for herself. The weeks after Sarah settled into her new apartment were a strange mix of peace and confusion. She had spent so much time trying to figure out who she was in the context of her marriage and family that it felt almost foreign to define herself as something outside of that. But now, in the quiet of her small apartment, she realized that for the first time in years, she was truly herself. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, when the silence seemed to echo too loudly. But Sarah refused to let that hold her back. She had made the decision to leave for a reason, and no matter how hard it got, she knew she couldn't go back. Sarah had always been someone who thrived on routine. Even though she had left behind a life filled with obligations and responsibilities, she found herself establishing new routines. Each morning, she would wake up early, go for a walk in the nearby park, and then have a cup of coffee while reading a book. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers. The more time she spent alone, the more she began to reconnect with the things she had once loved but had let slip away in the chaos of her old life. She found herself painting again, spending hours creating, allowing her mind to wander freely. It was the kind of freedom she hadn't felt in so long. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to live up to anyone's expectations but her own. One evening, as she sat on her couch, curled up with a novel, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily, her best friend, inviting her to a local art gallery opening. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had been so focused on rebuilding her life that she hadn't thought much about socializing. But Emily had been a constant support to her throughout everything, and she couldn't help but feel a pull to get out, to try something new. After a few minutes of indecision, Sarah typed back, "I'd love to go." The next evening, Sarah found herself walking into a brightly lit art gallery, the walls adorned with vibrant paintings and sculptures. She was immediately struck by the energy in the room. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt so alive, so different from the quiet solitude of her apartment. Emily greeted her with a warm hug, and they wandered through the exhibits together, discussing the artwork and enjoying each other's company. Sarah felt a sense of connection she hadn't realized she had been missing. As they made their way through the gallery, a man approached them. He was tall, with dark hair and a kind smile. He introduced himself as Jack, the owner of the gallery. He and Emily had been friends for years, and it wasn't long before the three of them were deep in conversation. Jack was easy to talk to, his warmth and charisma putting Sarah at ease. They chatted about art, life, and everything in between. For the first time in a long while, Sarah found herself laughing and enjoying the moment, not worrying about the past or the future. Jack and Sarah exchanged numbers that night, and they started texting casually over the next few days. It wasn't anything serious, but for Sarah, it was a reminder that she was still capable of connecting with others, of allowing herself to be seen. As the days passed, Sarah began to feel a subtle shift within herself. She was still grieving the loss of her marriage, still processing the pain and the heartbreak, but she wasn't consumed by it anymore. She had started to rebuild, one small step at a time. She was learning how to trust herself again, how to embrace the unknown. She didn't have all the answers, but she was starting to see the beauty in the journey, in the freedom that came with forging her own path. One afternoon, Sarah sat in a small cafe, sipping on her coffee, when she noticed a familiar face walking in. It was John. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, She froze. He didn't see her at first, but when he looked up, their eyes met. The shock on his face was immediate, but he quickly composed himself and walked over. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah stood up, unsure of what to say. There was a moment of silence before she spoke. "It's good to see you, John," she said quietly. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, both of them unsure of how to navigate this awkward encounter. "How have you been?" John asked, taking a seat across from her. "I've been okay," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "It's been a lot of change, but I'm managing." John nodded, his eyes searching hers. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted. "About everything that happened. I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me most, and I regret that. I've been trying to figure out how to make things right, but I don't know if it's too late." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Hearing him say that, hearing the regret in his voice, brought back so many memories, so many emotions she had tried to bury. She had spent so much time trying to figure out where it all went wrong, and now, here he was, saying the words she had wanted to hear. But part of her wasn't sure she was ready to let go of the pain, to forgive so easily. She looked at John, taking a deep breath. "I don't know if we can fix everything, John, but I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I've changed, and I think it's important that we both take time to figure out who we are now, separately." John looked down, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "I get it," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for any of this to happen." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't a resolution, and it wasn't an answer, but it was something. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that this moment, this small exchange of honesty, was a step toward healing. As they parted ways that afternoon, Sarah felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure if she would ever be able to forgive John fully or if their relationship would ever be repaired, but she knew that it was okay. She had done the hardest part, she had let go, and in doing so, she had given herself the chance to heal. In the weeks that followed, Sarah settled deeper into her new life. Her mornings had found rhythm in peaceful walks through the neighborhood, and her evenings, often spent with a book or lost in her art, became an escape. The silence of her small apartment had transformed from a symbol of isolation to one of freedom, a place where she could rediscover who she was without the weight of expectations. It wasn't perfect. Some nights, the longing for the family she had once known would creep in, reminding her of the love she had tried so hard to hold on to. But each day, the emotional fog lifted a little more. It was in the little things, like waking up to sunlight streaming through the window, or hearing the soft hum of the city outside, that Sarah began to reconnect with the woman she had lost. She started reaching out to friends more often. Emily, of course, had been a steady support, but others, too, began to call. She was reminded that there were people who cared about her, who wanted to be part of her life. For so long, she had been wrapped up in her role as wife and stepmother, that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be Sarah. Slowly, she was learning again. One weekend, as Sarah sat in the coffee shop where she had spent many quiet afternoons, she spotted someone familiar, Jack, the art gallery owner. He was across the room, chatting with a few people, but when his eyes met hers, a small smile spread across his face. He waved, and she waved back, feeling an odd sense of comfort. After finishing her coffee, Sarah found herself walking over to him, unsure of what to say, but something about the moment felt right. "Hey, how have you been?" Sarah asked as she approached. "I've been good," Jack said with a warm smile. "I was hoping we could catch up soon. I know you've had a lot on your plate lately." His voice was gentle, and for a moment, Sarah was reminded of the easy, effortless conversation they had shared when they first met. They agreed to meet later that week, and it was the beginning of a new, slow-building connection. Jack was understanding and patient, never pushing Sarah beyond what she was ready to share. Their conversations centered around art, life, and the occasional joke, but they also opened a space for Sarah to process her feelings. She found herself laughing, sharing bits and pieces of her past without the heaviness she had felt before. It was a slow unraveling, but with Jack, she felt seen again, in a way she hadn't realized she had missed. The more they met, the more Sarah realized how much she had neglected her own needs over the years. She had spent so much time trying to meet the needs of others, whether it was John, Ethan, or anyone else she had cared about. With Jack, She didn't feel like she was carrying anyone's burdens. There was no pressure to be something she wasn't. It was freeing, but it was also unsettling. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready for anything more than friendship. The idea of jumping into a relationship, any relationship, felt too soon, too complicated. Still, she couldn't ignore the connection that was growing between them. One night, as they walked out of a local cafe together, Jack turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I know things have been rough for you," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I just want you to know that I'm here, however you need me to be. No pressure, no expectations. Just here." Sarah stopped, walking, surprised by his words. She had never expected Jack to be so open, so understanding. It made her heart feel light, yet heavy with the weight of what she still carried. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was as though, in that moment, she was finally able to exhale. She didn't need to have it all figured out. She didn't need to rush into anything. For once, she could just be. That realization was both comforting and terrifying. It meant facing her fears head-on. Fears of being hurt again, of losing herself in another relationship, of not being enough. But she knew she wasn't ready to face those fears just yet. For now, she was content in the space she had carved out for herself. The next few months were filled with small victories. Sarah began to take on new projects at work, ones that had been pushed aside for far too long. She enrolled in a painting class at a local community center, allowing herself the joy of learning something new. Every day felt like a step forward, but also a quiet acknowledgement of how far she had come. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt. She still thought about John sometimes, about the life they had shared and the love that had once been there. But she no longer carried that burden as a weight. It was a part of her past, not her present. Jack, too, became a steady presence in her life. They continued to meet, sharing dinner, taking walks in the park, talking about their hopes, their fears, and the intricacies of everyday life. Slowly, Sarah let herself be open to the possibility of a future, even if she wasn't sure what that future would look like. She didn't need all the answers right now. All she needed was to trust that, one step at a time, she could build the life she wanted, on her terms. One evening, as Sarah sat on her couch, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows on the walls, she reflected on everything she had been through. She had come so far. She had started over. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had learned that the most important love she could ever give was the love she gave to herself. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined her. She had found strength in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the chaos. Sarah knew that there would still be challenges ahead. There always would be. But she was no longer afraid to face them. She had finally found peace, not in perfection, but in the acceptance of her own journey. As the months passed, Sarah's life continued to unfold in ways she never expected. Her new routine felt like a patchwork of old habits and new beginnings. She had learned how to balance the quiet and the chaos, the moments of self-reflection with the small bursts of excitement that came with trying new things. The pain of her past wasn't gone, but it no longer held the same power over her. She had let go of so much, but there was still one thing that lingered: her relationship with John. It wasn't that she missed him. It was the idea of him, the person he had once been. Sarah often found herself thinking back to the early days of their relationship, to the promise they had made to each other, and to the way their love had once felt so effortless. But now, with time and distance between them, it was clear that those days were gone. The realization that their marriage was truly over had been difficult, but it had also been liberating. She no longer needed to hold on to the hope that things would somehow go back to what they once were. Sarah had spent so much time waiting for John to come around, to see her as an equal partner in their relationship, but she had come to understand that waiting would never change the reality of their situation. She had given him every chance, every opportunity to step up, but he had failed to do so. And in the end, it wasn't just him that had failed, it was her, too. She had stayed too long in a relationship that no longer served her, and in doing so, she had neglected her own needs. It wasn't an easy truth to face, but it was one that Sarah had come to accept. She could no longer hold on to the past. But even with that acceptance, there were still moments of doubt. Sarah still had a hard time letting go of the idea of family, of what she had once hoped for. She missed the sound of laughter filling the house, the sense of connection that had once bound them all together. But those moments were fading, becoming less frequent, as Sarah built her own life from the ground up. Her relationship with Jack, though still in its early stages, had become a steady presence in her life. He was patient and understanding, never pushing her to move faster than she was ready. They spent their time together in a way that felt natural, easy. Jack never tried to fix her, never tried to make her forget her past. Instead, he let her process her feelings at her own pace, offering a comforting space for her to heal. He wasn't the solution to all of Sarah's problems, but he was a reminder that there was more to life than the pain she had experienced. As Sarah spent more time with Jack, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She shared stories from her past, her hopes for the future, and the struggles she had faced in her marriage. Jack listened with genuine interest, never interrupting, never trying to offer solutions. He just listened, and that was something Sarah had rarely experienced in her past relationships. In return, Sarah was there for Jack, offering support and understanding when he needed it. Their connection was based on mutual respect and kindness, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was in a relationship where she could be herself without fear of judgment or rejection. But despite the comfort that Jack brought into her life, Sarah still found herself grappling with the aftermath of her divorce. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city below, Sarah realized that while she had come a long way, there was still one final step she needed to take. She had to forgive herself. She had spent so much time blaming herself for the end of her marriage, thinking that she had somehow failed. But the truth was, she hadn't. She had given everything she had, and in the end, it had just not been enough. It wasn't her fault that John had not been the person he once promised to be. It wasn't her fault that their marriage had fallen apart. The realization hit her with a wave of emotion. She had been carrying the weight of guilt for far too long, and it was time to let it go. She didn't need to punish herself any longer for the things she couldn't change. Slowly, Sarah began to let go of that guilt. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't a quick process, but she made the decision to stop holding herself responsible for things that were out of her control. She had done the best she could with the circumstances she had, and that was enough. The forgiveness didn't come all at once, but over time, Sarah felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She was free to move forward without the weight of the past dragging her down. It was a liberating feeling, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She no longer felt tethered to her past, to the life she had built with John. She was free to create her own future, one where she could finally prioritize her own happiness. The months that followed were filled with new opportunities and new beginnings. Sarah continued to grow in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found fulfillment in her work, in her art, and in her relationships. The journey wasn't without its challenges, but with each step, she grew stronger. One afternoon, as Sarah stood in front of a canvas in her studio, a sense of calm washed over her. She was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to embrace it, knowing that the path ahead would be her own to create. Jack's presence in her life had shown her that love didn't have to come with expectations or pressure. It could be slow, steady, and built on mutual understanding. And though she wasn't ready to commit to a new relationship just yet, she knew that whatever happened, she was capable of taking care of herself. For the first time in years, Sarah felt truly independent. She had reclaimed her life, her happiness, and most importantly, her sense of self. She had learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one she had with herself. And with that realization, Sarah was ready to step into the future, whatever it may hold. As Sarah continued her journey, she began to understand that healing wasn't a linear process. There were days when the weight of the past seemed to return, as if it had never left. On those days, she would retreat into herself, sometimes feeling overwhelmed by the memories of what she had endured. But slowly, she began to realize that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it. Sarah had come to accept that she couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she moved forward. It wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. And with each day, she felt herself becoming stronger, more resilient. She was learning to embrace the uncertainty of life, to stop trying to predict the future and instead focus on what she could do in the present. One evening, as she sat in the park near her apartment, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the sky. She had spent so much time looking for answers, for some grand revelation that would make everything make sense. But now, she realized that the answers weren't as important as the journey itself. She had spent so many years trying to control her circumstances, to make things work when they weren't meant to. Now, she was learning to let go, to trust that life would unfold as it was supposed to. Her relationship with Jack had remained steady, though they hadn't rushed into anything. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready for a full commitment yet, but she appreciated the connection they had. It was simple, grounded in friendship, mutual respect, and understanding. Jack never pushed her, never tried to make her into someone she wasn't. He accepted her as she was, flaws, scars, and all. That acceptance was something Sarah had never truly experienced before, and it was freeing. She wasn't trying to be perfect for anyone. She was simply learning to be herself. Sarah's friendships had also blossomed. Emily, as always, was a constant source of support, but she had also reconnected with other friends she hadn't spoken to in a while. They shared laughs, stories, and moments of vulnerability. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was part of a community, a group of people who saw her for who she truly was. She wasn't just a wife or a stepmother. She was Sarah, an individual with her own dreams, her own desires, and her own path to follow. The more she embraced this truth, the more empowered she felt. Sarah knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be moments of doubt, moments when the pain of her past would resurface. But she no longer saw those moments as setbacks. Instead, she saw them as opportunities to grow, to continue learning and evolving. She understood now that healing was not about erasing the past, but about integrating it into her life in a way that allowed her to move forward with peace. As the months went on, Sarah continued to find new joys in her life. She took on new creative projects, traveling to places she had always wanted to visit, and pursuing passions she had put on hold for years. Her art blossomed in ways she hadn't expected. It became a way for her to process her emotions, to express herself in ways words couldn't capture. Her paintings were filled with colors, patterns, and textures that reflected her journey, a journey of pain, healing, and ultimately, self-empowerment. One afternoon, as she stood in front of a canvas, Sarah realized how far she had come. She looked at the artwork before her, vibrant, bold, and full of life, and smiled. It was a reflection of her own transformation, a visual representation of the strength and resilience she had cultivated over the past year. She was no longer the woman who had walked away from her marriage, unsure of who she was or what she wanted. She was someone different now, stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. As she looked at her painting, she thought back to everything she had gone through, the struggles, the heartache, and the moments of doubt. And yet, she had made it through. She had come out the other side, not unscathed, but more whole than she had ever been. She was proud of herself for taking that first step toward freedom, for walking away from a life that no longer served her. Sarah had learned that it wasn't the things we lose in life that define us. It's how we rise after losing them. The pain, the heartbreak, and the uncertainty were all part of her story, but they didn't control her anymore. She had taken the lessons from those experiences and used them to build a new life, one that was rooted in self-love, resilience, and the courage to move forward. Sarah knew that life would continue to throw challenges her way, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength to overcome it. And as she stood in front of the canvas, painting a future that was her own, she realized that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.